Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 12th of July and today we're going to be doing a full front update, and we're going to start off with the Lyman Kreminna direction where the Russians have begun conducting offensive activities, and we're also going to talk about what happened on July 10th because I didn't make a video on that day. So July 10th, in this general area, the Ukrainians were just beginning to move reinforcements towards the front line. And this was theorized to be because they were playing their own counterattacks, but perhaps it was because they were anticipating a Russian attack that was about to begin, which we do know now has already started. So the Ukrainians, specifically from the 44th Mechanized Brigade, they moved in a lot of their manpower and equipment towards Liman. And from the 44th Mechanized Brigade, which was stationed around Chernihiv, you had about 2,600 men that were transferred to the front line, and then about a dozen or maybe a couple dozen armored fighting vehicles that were also transported from Chernihiv to Liman, and then from there they're going to be moved to different parts of the front line. And in addition, you had the 518th Battalion of the 1st Brigade, which I have marked over here. It's 1st Special Purpose Brigade, and this battalion arrived at the Zhuravka beam. And this is generally a low-lying piece of land which is mostly under Ukrainian control, and I'm marking it right now with these blue lines. And it's sort of this nature reserve. It's on very low elevation, and there's a ravine that's running through it. And it's also one of the biggest hotspots for the fighting that's been ongoing on the front line in the Svatove front really for a while now. And so the 518th Battalion was moved in order to try to reinforce the Ukrainian forward positions in this area. And then the 32nd Brigade, which is one of these newer units that was formed in 2023, that unit was also moved to the front lines in this general area, and it was moved in order to take up positions that were being vacated by the 92nd Brigade. And we're going to talk about the 92nd Brigade later on in the video, but the 32nd Brigade, one of these newer units, being moved in to replace the 92nd Brigade. But then going on to the 11th of July, that's when we begun seeing the Russian attacks all across the Kreminna-Lyman direction, across different parts of the front line. And let's zoom in and go through each specific attack. So starting off in the north, the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade began attacking the Ukrainian positions around this nature reserve, Zhuravka. And again, this is the nature reserve. They didn't actually enter much of the nature reserve itself, but they did take up positions in the high ground just to the north of it. And so now the Russians do have control of some heights that will be used to fire upon the Ukrainian forces. And a lot of these Ukrainian forces are running through this ravine and the areas adjacent to it, so they do not have the advantage of having the high ground. So they're being fired constantly from this area. And so the Ukrainians actually conducted an attempted counterattack immediately after the Russians took control of the high ground. So they started off with an MLRS barrage, and they fired shells from self-propelled howitzers, and they sent 3 tanks and 6 infantry fighting vehicles through the low elevated area. But the 21st Brigade was able to prevent any sort of Ukrainian breakthrough as the Ukrainians were trying to approach the heights. They were caught in this trap in this lower elevated area and had to retreat back to their original positions, which are closer to a town like Nevsky or like Avdiivka. And then let's actually look at the different elevation in this area, because I do find it to be interesting. Let's escape from this. So here you have the lower valley areas where the Ukrainians had positions in, and the Russians were able to take over this area generally. And so this gives them a good area to fire upon the Ukrainian forces as they're trying to conduct counterattacks, and also on the Ukrainian forces along the Zherebets River in that valley, which is a bit further to the west over here. So the Russians do have control of this pretty major ridge that is to the east of the Zherebets River Valley, which does give them great positions to fire upon the forward Ukrainian positions. Now, a bit further to the south, the Russians actually were able to infiltrate into the town of Torske. And this is a town that is very important because it's really this junction in between the Ukrainian bridgehead across the Zherebets River, and that bridgehead is over here. I'm making that blue. Over here, over here, over here. And the main Ukrainian reserve contingent on the Svatove front, which is based around major towns like Liman. And so Torsk is sort of a bridge that if you have control over, you could cross over the Zherebets River on either direction. And so now the Russian forces, they've already had this sort of spearhead pointed in the direction of Torsk for a couple of months, but it was always contained, and the Ukrainians were always able to hold the line around these red lines that I've marked over here. But over the past day, the Russians were able to conduct an offensive of their own and actually infiltrate into the town itself. And so they have positions in some of the northern suburbs where there's different residential houses, but also different facilities, warehouses, and such. There's a video that was posted by the 23rd Battalion, I believe, 23rd Separate Rifle Battalion, which is one of the units fighting on the front line. And this video was posted a couple of days ago, I believe, or it might have been posted yesterday. Either way, what it showed was the Ukrainian forces shelling the advancing Russian forces. And when that was geolocated, it was discovered that the Russians were within the town of Torsk itself. And so that would be pretty good evidence to indicate that the Russians had been able to break through. But upon the geolocation being publicly available, the Facebook account deleted the video, which could either indicate that they made a mistake and it was actually Russian forces that were shelling Ukrainians, or that they didn't want the public to be finding out that the Russians had actually entered Torsk. I think that it's pretty likely that it was actually Russian forces that were being fired upon, because this is not the only source that we've had that alleges that the Russians are in Torsk. There's plenty of sources that I've seen, both from the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, that are alleging that Russia's been able to reach the town itself, and it would also sort of back up the entire idea that Russia's conducting offensive activities all across the Svatove front. Really, the only source I've seen that has a big following that's denying it is the deep state map from the Ukrainian side. They have not updated their maps, but I'm going to tentatively update it. If anything changes, then I'll obviously tell you guys. But it does seem like Torsk is now contested, so let's change the marking to black. Now, a bit further to the south, around the Zerebryansky forest, in this area, the Ukrainians are still trying to conduct counterattacks of their own, trying to break through into the Dibrova town. And Dibrova is one of these forward operating bases for the Russian forces. And so in this area, the Ukrainians conducted 5 different attacks yesterday. All of them were stopped by the Russian local artillery. And in this area, most of the fighting didn't even reach Dibrova itself. It really only happened in the southwestern corner of the front line in that area that I have marked with the blue rectangle, and the Ukrainians were pushed back. But the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to their bridgehead across the Zherebets River. They are building different fortifications, including with different concrete barriers on the area just to the east of the Zherebets River that I have marked in this rectangle over here, and that's within the forest itself. So they're going to be setting up different kinds of dugouts in this area in anticipation for the Russian advance. And the Russian advance in this area really does pose a threat of taking over the entirety of the Ukrainian Zherebets bridgehead. So you can already see the different spears of attack that Russians are launching. And these are the 2 main arrows where we've seen the Russian advances. And you can see how they're going to try to squeeze out the Ukrainian contingent in this square, try to push them back to the river and across the river and occupy all of the adjacent towns. And then from there, cross the river itself, perhaps. But that's looking a bit forward into the future. The immediate Russian goal is clearing out the Zherebets bridgehead, and then from there to make their way into the city of Lyman, which is extremely important if the Russians ever want to get full control of Donbass. And so now we're seeing Russians actually going on the offensive, not even just in Svatove, but also a bit to the south, around Spirne. So the Russian assaults in this area started on the 10th, when the Russian forces were able to advance through some open fields on the southern flank of Spirne, which sort of shapes the battlefield in a way that is advantageous for the Russians, as they have very advantageous firing positions to the south of Spirne that allow them to fire onto troops that are within the town of Spirne itself or are making their way to Spirne from Ivano-Darivka. And Ivano-Darivka is another important town that has plenty of fortifications to the west of it. There's a major Ukrainian fortress that the Russians will probably be seeking to take over in the future. But first, Spirne. So on the 11th, after the southern flank was secured to a certain extent, then the Russians went on an attack on the northern flank of Spirne. And they got control of some heights that are overlooking the town of Spirne, because Spirne is on very low elevation, because you have this river, this very, very narrow river that runs just to the north of it. And so the Russian forces now have control of the hills overlooking that river and overlooking Spirne, including all of the routes from Ivano-Darivka and Spirne, which will make it very hard for reinforcements and resupply to come in. Now, I do believe the Ukrainians are still going to be able to hold on to Spirne for a while if they dig their heels in, but it will undoubtedly lead to some pretty significant casualties in the process. Let's actually look at the elevation map. So here you have the elevation. Russia's have positions on the southern heights, and then they also have positions in a more significant height to the north of Spirne. And the Ukrainian positions would be around the more western portion of Spirne itself and in Ivano-Darivka, all of that in a valley as well. And then, of course, you have the Suka Plotva River running through Spirne as well. Now, moving a bit to the south towards the Bakhmut front, in this area, the Ukrainians are actually on the offensive mode, trying to conduct their own assaults. And we have, first of all, the 92nd Mechanized Brigade, previously stationed around the entire Zvatove front, has been moved towards the Bakhmut front, which does indicate that the Ukrainians are planning some sort of offensive activity. 92nd Mechanized Brigade is very experienced with such attacks, as they were one of the spearheads of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and they've been fighting in that area ever since. Now they're being moved to this direction. And even before this brigade moved in, you already had the 54th Mechanized Brigade, are also stationed around Avdiivka, trying to break through the Russian line to the north of Yakovlivka. And we sort of briefly talked about that in a video 2 days ago, talking about how the Ukrainians were able to launch this very small infantry attack towards Yakovlivka. They didn't actually enter the town of Yakovlivka itself, but on the 9th, I believe that's when it was, the Ukrainian forces were dismounted in certain launch points that were pretty close to Yakovlivka, a bit to the northwest. And so they are fighting over some of the trench lines and bush lines to the north of it before they go for the town itself. Now, once the Ukrainian forces and specifically the 54th Brigade broke through the Russian forward line, which was around here, I'll map it in red. See, it's like basically like this. Once they broke through that initial line with that first spearhead, by the 10th and 11th of July, they solidified further control over those positions, over those bush lines, and took over adjacent fields. And so now the front line looks more like this, where they have control over these two rectangles. And they are trying to position themselves in a way where they could have control over some of the heights overlooking Yakovlivka. Yakovlivka is on very low elevation, but the thing is, there's not that much higher ground to the north of Yakovlivka. There are a few very minor hills to the northwest, which is the best that the Ukrainians will be able to achieve. But the unfortunate reality for the Ukrainians is that the Russians do control the ridge to the south of Yakovlivka, which is very high elevation compared to the surrounding areas. So these two rectangles basically would indicate the area where the ridge spans, and that's where you have a lot of Russia's forward howitzers stationed and mortars, and that's an area that they can fall back to if they ever lose Yakovlivka, and that would prevent a further degradation or further breakthrough in the Russian lines, because it's pretty clear what the Ukrainians are trying to do here through trying to probe into Yakovlivka and trying to finally take it over. Their goal is to flank the entirety of the Russian grouping, both in Soledar and in Bakhmut. And they're trying to do that by cutting off the northern supply lines. First of all, the highway running through Yakovlivka and then through Soledar into Bakhmut. And then it's very unrealistic in the short term, even the long term, but even towards this highway over here, which runs through Popasnaya into Bakhmut. And so the entire vector through which they're trying to do this is by taking over Yakovlivka and then sort of trying to tap into their gains and try to expand them even further through this pincer move, once from the north and then one from the south, as we're going to get into. The southern attack around Klishivka, it is not really changed much, the situation in this area. The only change of the front lines that we've noticed around Klishivka is a minor Russian counterattack where they were able to retake some positions. Over here in this general red rectangle, let's actually look at the distance of how much they advanced. It's probably only about something like 0.4 miles, 0.5 miles at most that they advanced, but they were able to take over a piece of open field. They were able to get piece of a bush line and take control over certain parts of a local road. But all of this is now positional fighting, trying to position themselves in the best way for the upcoming battles for Klishivka itself, as Ukraine continues to send resources from the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is the main unit trying to fight around Klishivka. And they're preparing, trying to fortify their positions on the high ground as they begin to launch incursions into Klishivka itself. Meanwhile, the Russians, they're sending their own reinforcements in this direction because they realize the threat that could occur if the Ukrainians tap into their gains in this area and get control over Klishivka. That could have an effect on the entire southern flank around Bakhmut, which is why this town is extremely important. But for now, very low level changes to the map. Now, around Avdiivka, we do also have some news, some activity. The Russians are trying to attack the Ukrainian positions in Novokalinove, and they're trying to break through the area around the rail line. So the current front line is around this rail line, and they're trying to break through past the open fields into the town itself, but there's no reported gains as of yet. And the Russians also conducted their own attack in the direction of these local dachas, these rural houses in the northeastern parts of Avdiivka in this general perimeter, but they were very unsuccessful in their attacks. But what this does indicate is that the Russians are a bit deeper and a bit closer towards Avdiivka than was previously thought. So I did move the front line a bit to the south and gave them control of some of the land that is adjacent to this local pond. Now, a bit further to the south around the Vodiane front, in this area, the Ukrainians have been trying to conduct limited counterattacks for a very long time, and they recently did try to break through the Russian fort positions along this bush line over here. So they had an attack. It was dissipated by the Russian artillery. There's a lot of Russian artillery pieces that are stationed all around the perimeter of Donetsk. So this is one of the areas where Russian artillery is the strongest. It's one of the reasons why Ukraine isn't able to succeed in most of their counterattacks in this area. The front line is usually static over here, but the Russians did go on the counterattack right after the Ukrainian attack of their own, and they did advance in the direction of this town, Severinoy, but they have not taken it over yet. They have control over two new bush lines, which they secured, and they're very, very close to the southern outskirts of the town. They also have not full fire control, but they are able to fire onto the local road that connects the towns of Orlivka to Lastochkinie, which is very important for Ukraine's supply lines into Avdiivka. So this could be something that the Russians could tap into in the future as they begin advancing in the direction of these supply lines. A lot of them are linked to Orlivka, and so it would be definitely a Russian goal to either reach Orlivka or reach positions where they could fire onto the roads that branch out from Orlivka. Now, moving south to Velyka Novosilka and that entire front, there is some activity. The Ukrainians are making gains in that direction. So specifically, the 501st Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade, they were able to take control over this nature reserve called Husheva Balka. And that nature reserve, we talked about it before, it's generally in this rectangle. They've been able to fully secure it now, and they're now using it as a new forward position. They're digging in. And this nature reserve is directly to the north of Putnia. So the implication is pretty clear. The Ukrainians are gearing up for an attack head on onto Putnia. But that's not the only area they're going to try to attack that town from. A bit to the east, you have several different units, including 31st Brigade, 35th Brigade, 36th Brigade. Obviously, not the entire brigades, but different assault detachments from those brigades. They are and have actually, from the past 2 days, been able to clear out the Russian fort positions to the northeast of Stormayorsk, which have been located around this red rectangle. So, in terms of the distance that the Ukrainians advanced, they were able to perhaps advance, 1.3 miles all around this direction, all around this perimeter. And so now the Ukrainians have full control over the area to the northwest of Stormayorsk. This gives them an opportunity to flank the town and begin attacking from multiple directions. They've already tried attacking directly from the north, but have been unsuccessful. Perhaps a joint attack from two different directions would be enough to take over the town itself, and that would give the Ukrainians opportunity to further advance along the Makariali River and around the adjacent roads towards their ultimate goal in this region, which is Storm-Linivka. But in terms of the front line at the moment, the Ukrainians are building up resources all across the Putnia, basically perimeter, around the Vadne, we said already, around the nature reserve, and also in the fortified areas to the northwest of Sormayorsk, where you do have a lot of Ukrainian resources. So there's three possible directions for an attack on Prudnia that are being planned, and they're being aided by artillery from the 72nd Brigade. Now, the final part of the front line we're going to be talking about is the Orikhiv sector. We did mention this in a previous video, but the Ukrainians did attempt to break through at a different part of the front line, which is pretty close to Robotyne. This time they tried breaking through to the south of Bakhmut. They had full control over Bakhmut, and so they were able to advance at maximum 0.5 miles. They were able to, at a certain extent, reach 0.7, 0.8 miles, the Ukrainian forces. And so the timeline for the Ukrainian assault in this direction is that you had these small assault groups which were actually going on foot from the 47th Brigade, and they pushed this spearhead that you're seeing over here in this blue rectangle. They pushed that spearhead, and they established four positions on July 9th. And then they stayed entrenched in there throughout the night, and then on the morning of July 10th, they received reinforcements, more groups of infantry, a tank was sent in, and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles were also sent in to basically get control over this key road which leads from Robotyne to Vrobove. And let's actually zoom in to see that road. This road is over here. So the Ukrainian objective was to cut off that road, to cut off the connection and communication between the different key hubs of defense across the entire Russian defensive line. So for a certain period of time, they were actually successful in this. The Ukrainian forces with their infantry fighting vehicles, including Bradleys. So maybe this was the maximum extent of their spearhead, but they were very quickly pushed back because this entire area is completely open. There's basically no cover. There are some different tree lines. That's the best area for concealment, I suppose, for infantrymen. That's not going to be enough if you're in a Bradley, though. And the problem is a lot of these trees, they don't have any foliage anymore. A lot of them have been totally devastated by the constant fighting and constant shelling in this area, so you can't even use that as concealment anymore. So the Ukrainian forces were quickly pushed back from their four positions by the 71st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. The Ukrainians probably do still hold control over a part of the spearhead, the part that's about 0.5 miles away from the initial Russian forward position. But any further incursions have been and will continue to be met by Russian anti-tank fire, by Russian drones, and of course by the Russian artillery in this area. And so the only reason why the Ukrainians even attacked in this direction in the first place is because they've been testing out different areas from which to attack Robotyne. Each one failed. We talked before about attacking directly to the north through that main road, from the northwest through the bush lines, and now they're trying to attack from this new direction of Bakhmut. And this area is actually an area that has very little mine presence. Russians do not put many land mines and anti-vehicle mines across these open fields, which is why the Ukrainians found it to be basically the best area from which they could launch a new assault. And so that's why they even did that in the first place. But last thing before I end the video is that there's now reports that I've seen from Russian sources that the Ukrainians are firing cluster munitions into Tokmak. Now, that could be the cluster munitions that Ukraine previously had in their stockpile, because I know they did have previous cluster munitions. But something that I read in an article recently about the shipment of cluster munitions, I think it was from Yahoo News, is that the Americans, they have all these different stockpiles of cluster munitions all across the world, but especially in Eastern Europe and a place like Poland, because they were basically anticipating the allowance or the agreement by the DoD to send the cluster munitions. So it was anticipated for a long time. So for a while, you had the cluster munitions in Poland on the border with Ukraine, and they were ready for the second in which the shipment of cluster munitions would be green lighted. They were waiting for that moment, and they were ready for it. So the moment that it was given the green light, then that's when you had the Americans immediately ship it across the border, and it immediately made its way to the Ukraine front lines. And there were estimates from some sources that said that it would be even 24 hours. So that's a very quick amount of time. Obviously, not all the cluster munitions, because there's millions of DPICMs that in theory, America could send to Ukraine. I don't know how many they will send in. Even if they do send them, then it will take a very long time for all of them. You do have a lot of them in South Korea, for instance, and in other countries that are allied with the United States, and some of them would probably be weary about moving them out to Ukraine. But at the very least, some of them are already being moved in and perhaps even being used on the front line already. So we're going to have to see what sort of difference that makes on the front line. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.